Welcome back. This is Josephine Reed bringing you On the Margin. I'm here for part 2 of the show. Gio very nicely did a great job with part 1, and I hope to continue with Mendi and Keith Obadike. They're conceptual artists who draw from a multitude of art practices. She's a poet. He's a musician and sound designer. They both embrace digital art and computer programming, and they blend all these forms together and create new ways of examining issues that persist in our culture, namely those of race and identity. They have exhibited their work widely and have received many awards, including a Rockefeller Scholarship for New Media Art and a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship in Fiction. Their current exhibition can be seen through June 30th at the Studio Museum in Harlem. It's called American Cypher, and it looks at the role of DNA in American culture. Mendi and Keith are joining me by phone from New York City. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, I want to begin, actually, with first things first, and that is, can you tell me what conceptual art is?
Yeah, so let's see. I mean, there's a long history, and there are probably many answers to it. But I think a short answer would be it's a practice that emerged in the 1960s that sort of privileged the idea over sort of the object or a concrete sort of end product. So the ideas started to lead.
So the idea would become more important than the painting, let's say?
Right. So when this practice emerged, artists started sort of making proposals as artworks in some cases. For us, this is mainly shown up in a lot of sort of online pieces, sort of sound pieces. So some of our things might be considered sort of formalist pieces, but other pieces might look like traditional conceptual art.
Okay, now here's my second question, and that's what drew you to it. For example, Mendi, what made you step beyond or add to writing poetry? You've won prizes for poetry, after all.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm gone from poetry, but a lot of the things that we do, together are interdisciplinary in nature, and in some ways doing interdisciplinary work is also doing conceptual work, doing a project that can span across all of those things, across, say, music and literature, puts it in the realm of conceptual, So I would say that this interest in speaking across forms and speaking to lots of communities is part of what got me to thinking more broadly, generally.
So it's the ability to add, and I'm putting this in very practical terms, a lot of different tools in that artistic tool bag so you can build something different?
Yeah. I mean, we started sort of collaborating together. Just a little bit about our history. I mean, we're from the same hometown. We grew up together, and we started collaborating together maybe about 16, 17 years ago. And as you mentioned, Mendi came from poetry and I came from music. And when we started making things together, these things started to come out, as artworks, as things, first as sort of computer-based pieces, things online, and then later sort of museum and theater pieces. And so it was really just what our collaborations came out as.
Yeah, a lot of times we're doing the same thing, but the way that they sort of fit into other communities is part of what gets us to this space,
It's interesting because I know for sound pieces, sonic pieces, it's not as though I have a visualization process that doesn't trot right along with that sound. And I'm thinking most specifically of your work of African Metropole when you did Sonic City Lagos.
Uh-huh.
It's not like I wasn't visualizing as I was listening.
Right.
And I think there's something about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's something about your work that uses one sense to encourage the listener or the viewer to start to generate images or sounds in the others. Does that make sense?
That's exactly what we're thinking about in a lot of cases, yeah. We're interested in that space of imagination and how you access that in the surprising ways you might access that from one sense.
into another. So you're kind of prompting the listener or the viewer's imagination with your work.
Well, that's what we hope.
Yeah, and that's what and it's fair to say that's also one of the purposes of conceptual art, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the idea for many conceptual artists is to sort of ask the viewer or the participant to sort of reconsider what art is, and so that is a part of our practice. We want the viewer, the participant, to think about sort of the boundaries or the nature of art itself, but we also want the person to think about what it means for an idea to show up in one form versus another.
Right. And let's talk about the show that is now at the Studio Museum in Harlem and will be until June 30th. It's called American Cypher. I'll let you decide which way to go. Should we talk about what inspired it, or do you want to give us sort of a broad outline of what it is?
Let's see. I guess we could do a little bit
of both.
Of both, yeah. So first, the way we started the project was commissioned by Bucknell University, the Griot Institute for Africana Studies at Bucknell, and the Samick Art Gallery. So Bucknell is a university in Pennsylvania, and so they asked us to make a piece about this relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who was his slave and also the mother of his children, some of his children.
She was also the half-sister of his wife, who had been deceased at the time. And so the way we wanted to think about this was through DNA and the fact that there had been a story about their relationship since the time of their life, and Sally Hemings' descendants had passed down the story as well. But it sort of took a new life in American culture with the DNA when their descendants' DNAs were tested and against each other, and so that sort of brought a kind of new life into the story about who Thomas Jefferson was, especially. And we were really interested in what work DNA was being used to do, not only in that story, but in some other stories as well.
Yeah, so just a little bit more, for anyone who doesn't know the story. So for many years, it was rumored that Thomas Jefferson had children with his slave, Sally Hemings. But the official record always was this was not the case. In 1998, sort of DNA tests proved that this was the case, that Sally Hemings' children were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Since then, the contest has continued. But anyway, so that was a spark for our project. So we thought, wow, okay, so here's a story sort of in early American history that is turning on sort of DNA science, the question of, this science in our identities. And so we looked for other stories that might also sort of turn on identity, turn on DNA science in the same kind of way.
Yeah, and one of the people you have, we can go. You look at 5 stories, including Sally Hemings, who's at the center of it. We begin with James. Tell us about James Watson.
Yes, so James Watson is a well-known geneticist, sort of the person who discovered, along with Francis Crick, the sort of shape of the double helix, the sort of iconic image of DNA. So Watson is well known and respected, but in recent years he made a statement saying that science suggests that Africans are genetically inferior. So this became a sort of a big embarrassment for many people associated with Watson, and he was sort of encouraged to retire from his post at his lab. And then later, some stories came out in the press that said, well, actually, Watson had some sort of African heritage, that he was of African descent.
16 times more genes of black origin than the average white European is what they said, technically.
So we thought this was an interesting story, and so, of course, we had to include him in the project.
And then the use of DNA in criminal justice, which, of course, basically you open any paper in any city in the country throughout the United States, and you will find a story about that.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are just more and more stories every day, but we focused on the stories of two people. One who was innocent but had been imprisoned for 35 years. His name is James Bain, and he was released due to DNA evidence. And he's the person who had been in prison for the longest, whose case had been overturned by DNA evidence. And the other person is, in the media, he was called the Grim Sleeper. He's a serial killer who had escaped. But he was eventually caught because his son's DNA was in a familial archive. And so what this is that when they have DNA evidence collected from a crime scene, they can check it against all of the DNA that has been collected elsewhere and see who is related to that person. So what happened is his son's DNA was collected. They knew that the person who was a serial killer was related to this person. And so for us, it's an interesting thing. Like the DNA evidence opens up a lot of doors. In some cases, it's pretty clear that an innocent person being released is a good thing. And it seems like also a guilty person being caught is a good thing. But there's an interesting kind of problem with the fact that black people are disproportionately collected in this familial archive. And so there's this question about what it means to have sort of tracking of black people on a wide scale. Where will this go? You know, what corner are we?
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. That I did not know about that story. That is absolutely fascinating that they used the DNA from his son to be able to discover and identify him.
Yeah, it's a really amazing story.
And then President Obama.
Yes. So it's interesting because over the course of the project, there's been more and more information about Obama's DNA. There's still more stuff that's being about his DNA, but all of the stories begin with this idea that he is this person from two different worlds, this black father and this white mother. And so we were interested in the way that the DNA stuff that's coming out about that family is always sort of doing more complicated things than this story that we retell over and over and over again. So recently there was a story about his mother's family going back to maybe the first one of the earliest African American families in this country, and then the kind of questions about how those families are connected. And so we're just asking ourselves, what does it mean if we look at these details and the science, and how does that really tell us about racial identity in this country? You know.
And then, I guess this is the one that surprised me the most, so I saved her for last. Oprah Winfrey.
Yeah. So Oprah does make an appearance in the project. Oprah is there because the scholar Henry Louis Gates did a project where he sort of looked at the family history of celebrities, and one of the people he looked at was Oprah's Roots. That was what the PBS special was called, Oprah's Roots, I think. And so while Oprah's sort of genetic history was being tested in order to find out where she was from on the continent of Africa, before the tests were concluded, sort of Oprah made statements in the press that she was Zulu, and that the test sort of concluded that she was actually Zulu from South Africa. Now, if you know anything about the history of Africans in America, you know that we didn't come from the southern part of Africa where the Zulus live, and so this
anything is possible, but that's highly unlikely.
That's highly unlikely. So I think she may have even made the statement while in South Africa. So I think the response from the Zulu community was, okay, well, this is interesting. We didn't know this, and of course later, when the sort of tests were concluded, she was actually, I think, from Liberia, I think. But she shows up in the project for us because, well, the whole question of can you find someone's point of origin on the globe through DNA test is a kind of, to us, it seems like a dubious project. It's becoming a big commercial business. And so we were interested in how these kind of internal desires that we have about sort of finding our place in the world get linked to a kind of new scientific process. And this happens again and again. It's just the latest version of it is now happening through sort of DNA science.
That's Keith Obadike. He and Mendi are conceptual artists and have a show at the Studio Museum in Harlem. It's called American Cypher. I'm Josephine Reed. You're listening to On the Margin on WPFW. Well, I mean, I want to go in two directions at once, so let me just start with this one. And that is it fair to say American Cypher is an ongoing project? I saw a version of it, for example, online, that you did in 2012.
Yes. So the early version of it was done at Bucknell University, and that version of it was a sound installation, and the sound installation had moving speakers. And now this latest version of it that's currently on view at the Studio Museum in Harlem has both a sound installation, a sort of multi-channel sound installation. There's a short video piece. There are some prints in the exhibition and the book. So there are a few more parts being shown in this version of it. So, as we exhibit it, the project will shift slightly. Because there's so many components to the project, and there are a lot of stories inside of the project.
And every institution is different as well, and that's also part of how the pieces get mounted. Has to do with our relationship with institutions as well.
Right, because it's the piece at Studio is site specific. You made it for Studio Museum.
Right, and it's a gallery space, and so there are different considerations there.
In Bucknell, it was in a public space, and so that's very different.
Yeah, Bucknell is in the student center, and so students sort of pass through it, and that sort of affected how we presented the piece and what kind of information we gave as people sort of entered the space.
Now, you have done a lot of work on the internet, on what's known as ArtNet, and now. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say net art.
NetArt. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
I knew I would say that backwards. NetArt. That's what I meant to say. And now you've expanded and you're doing work in public spaces as well as work in galleries. How does that change the way you conceptualize a piece?
Yeah, it's a really sort of interesting question, and one we sort of spent a lot of time thinking about. I think one thing is, we consider the things the sort of online pieces that we were doing in the 90s and sort of early part of this decade. We thought of those pieces as public pieces, like a piece we might do on a sort of university campus.
Exactly.
There are some differences in that people, at least when we were working online, there's a sort of shorter attention span, and so we made sort of smaller works. And once you work in a sort of physical public space, you work with time in a different kind of way. Does that sound accurate to you?
It does sound. I mean, that's what we talked about a lot. But I think the other thing that's different is that people feel like they can come back whenever they want to, and it's much easier for people to come back to a net art piece than it is to come back to a physical space, depending on their relationship to that space.
Mm-hmm,
so,
of course.
So all of those things, the amount of time people can come back and get more, that affects how we think about the speed of things that we want to offer to people.
I would also think that net art, and I know you've done pieces that were specifically interactive. Many of your pieces are interactive, and that I think is an easier thing to accomplish with net art.
Well, maybe not.
Okay.
I mean, I guess it depends on the project. I mean, sometimes when you're working online, there are many other things to sort of hold your attention online. And so if you're asking someone to do a kind of complex interaction, you have to sort of contend with the fact this person may also be sort of checking their email or
at work.
This is true.
Right. And so there are other challenges there.
But I would also think that would be true for art in a public space where somebody could be there, but, they're waiting for their boyfriend or, their kid is running around. Whereas in a gallery, I guess the thought is that it's more sustained interest. Somebody went there because they wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly sort of other kinds of things you can ask of a sort of viewer or participant in a museum or in a gallery space.
And we've been happy to see that at the City Museum people have spent time. We think of it as a really meditative piece, but you never know whether people are just going to like peek in and move on, or actually spend some time in there. And I've heard from a lot of people that they've gone and just spent a lot of time there, which is really good for us to hear. But you never know, you know.
Yeah.
You did, if you don't mind, I'd just like to talk briefly about an earlier piece that you did that was an online piece that I found amazingly intriguing, and it required a lot of interactivity, and that's called Interaction of Colors.
Mm-hmm.
That was fascinating. Can one of you just explain this and what you were doing with that?
Yeah, so that piece was commissioned by the Whitney Museum of American Art, and at that time they were sort of asking a lot of artists who were working online to make small pieces for a site they still have called Artport, and so the interaction of colors was we described it as an online brown paper bag test, and for anyone who doesn't know what that is, in American culture. Sort of the brown paper bag test was used as a sort of filter for certain kinds of social events or social clubs, mainly, in the black community. So, for example, if I was having a party, in the early part of the 20th century, I could sort of discriminate against who was coming into the party. I could say, well, if you're the color of this brown paper bag are lighter, you can come in, and if you're darker, you'll get refused. And so it was a kind of internal discrimination that was, born out of sort of internalized American racism. So we made a sort of digital version of the sort of brown paper bag test, and the point was to sort of think about, maybe how some of these same ideas about sort of social filtering are happening online and in sort of new sort of digital spaces.
And you asked people to respond, and the questionnaire that you developed was really kind of elaborate, I think.
Well, we were thinking about a couple of different things. One, there are all these ways that people sort of name skin color, but also we might have a name like light skin or dark skin, but that means a variety of different things depending on where you live, who your family is, where you fit on the spectrum in your own community. And so we asked maybe 45 questions about things people knew and how they related to the other people around them and the language they used for their own color and other people's color. Because our idea was that we were going to assign people a color at the end of the process. They were to take photographs of certain parts of their body that people have associated with detecting race before, and then answer this questionnaire, and that we were going to sort of use all that information to determine a skin color and give it a hex code, which is the name for the codes that determine the colors on the internet. And this way, the color would be you'd be able to know across different browsers what the skin color was. But for us, it was about the fact that this thing has been used to filter the different relationships to color have been used to filter people in and out of communities, but it's also a thing that's in flux even in that context.
Right. And you got a fairly large response, didn't you?
Yeah. We had a lot of responses, and as with any sort of online piece, you just never know what the response is going to be. But we sort of got a lot of sort of interesting sort of answers to the questions that we asked in the questionnaire, and people were sort of more than willing to send us photographs of their fingernails in the back of their ears and their elbows, and so it was an interesting project for us, and actually we just revisited that project for the first time in maybe like 10 years.
Yeah.
We just redid it with a group of students at Ramapo College and
in New Jersey.
In New Jersey, yeah. And we were working with a group of students. We probably would have, if you just asked us to sort of make a wild guess as we walked in the room, we probably would have said most of those students were white. That might have been how we would have identified them. But once we started having this conversation about identity and skin color and family heritage, all these sort of interesting stories came out about how these folks identified themselves. And so, it was a big lesson for us in terms of, what kind of things you can actually learn if you ask people to sort of think about their identity in real time.
Mm-hmm. And it's easy to see an arc between that project and the current one, American Cypher.
Yeah, for us, we've been thinking about how identity gets encoded in a number of ways across a few projects. So that might be a through line between some of the work.
Yeah, I think when we were doing when we were almost all net art, I think we were responding to a lot of conversations about race online and whether there was race online and how it functioned, and we were interested in this kind of narrative discourse about race and media, but we were also interested in taking it back a step to some things that happened in the social world that didn't really rely on the filters of the internet, but were related to the sort of contemporary questions. And in this case, we're kind of sort of mining another kind of discourse around coding and how we say that someone is X versus Y. I mean, I think that's what a lot of our pieces come back to in one way or another. How do we say that, we're gonna call this thing X or Y?
Now, American Cypher is going to be at the Studio Theater in Harlem until June 30th. If people want more information, what should they do?
You can go to the Studio Museum's website. The Studio Museum is, I can tell you the address right now.
Yeah, please.
144 West 125th Street in New York.
144 West 125th, and this Sunday at 3 o'clock they can find you in discussion there, and that's free and open to the public, correct?
Right. So they have sort of free Sunday admission, and we're giving a talk there. We're in conversation with the curator, Abby Schreiber, who curated our exhibition there.
Well, Mendi and Keith Obadike, thank you so much. Your work is fascinating, and it always stimulates and provokes discussion, which I think is wonderful. So thank you for joining us.
Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Mendi and Keith Obadike, their exhibition is called American Cypher. It is at the Studio Museum in Harlem. You've been listening to On the Margin here on WPFW 89.3 FM. Michael Vernon is the engineer. I'm Josephine Reed. Johnny Eisenberg is next, so stay tuned.